She said she was volunteering at a community center, but when I followed her, she walked into a neon-lit building with no windows. What I found inside shocked me. She said she needed to give back, to find purpose, so she started volunteering 2 nights a week. But she always dressed up. I followed her one night, and she entered a strip club, VIP entrance. I walked in later. She wasn't a dancer, she was managing private rooms and coordinating events. She said she was just the organizer. She needed the extra money to pay off her brother's legal bills. Still, she never told me. She knew I'd disapprove. I didn't know what was worse, the secret, or how naturally she seemed to fit in there. The whole thing started about 6 months ago. My roommate had been going through this phase where she was constantly talking about finding meaning in her life, about how her regular job wasn't fulfilling enough. She'd come home from work looking drained, complaining that she felt like she was just going through the motions. Then one day, she announced she'd found the perfect solution, volunteering at a local community center twice a week. I thought it was great. Really, I did. She seemed so excited about it, talking about how she'd be helping organize events and coordinate activities for people in need. The way she described it made it sound like exactly what she needed, something that would give her that sense of purpose she'd been craving. But something fell off from the very beginning. For starters, she never talked about the actual work she was doing. When I'd ask about her volunteer shifts, she'd give these vague responses about organizing things and helping people, but never any specific details. No stories about the people she was helping, no complaints about difficult situations, nothing that you'd expect from someone doing real community work. Then there was the way she dressed for these volunteer sessions. I'd done my share of community service over the years, and I knew that most places were pretty casual. You'd wear comfortable clothes that you didn't mind getting dirty or worn out. But she would spend an hour getting ready, doing her makeup perfectly, choosing outfits that looked more appropriate for a night out than for helping at a community center. The first few times, I didn't think much of it. Maybe this particular place had different standards, or maybe she just wanted to look professional. But as the weeks went on, the pattern became more obvious. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she'd disappear into the bathroom for an extended beauty routine, emerge looking like she was ready for a date, and then head out with her purse and nothing else. No supplies, no materials. Nothing that suggested she was actually going to do any kind of volunteer work. I started paying more attention to her schedule. She'd leave around 7 in the evening and wouldn't get back until well after midnight. That seemed like an awfully long time for volunteer work, especially on weeknight evenings. When I mentioned this, she explained that they often had evening events that ran late, and she wanted to see them through to the end. The money situation was another red flag. She'd been complaining for months about being strapped for cash, about how expensive everything was getting. But suddenly, she seemed to have more spending money. Nothing dramatic, but I noticed she wasn't stressed about bills anymore, and she'd started picking up little luxuries that she'd been avoiding before. When I asked about it, she said she'd gotten a small raise at work. The breaking point came about 3 months into her volunteer work. I'd been having a particularly bad day, and I really needed to talk to someone. I knew she was at her volunteer job, but I thought maybe I could swing by and we could grab coffee afterward. I looked up the address she'd given me for the community center, and that's when things got weird. The address led me to a neighborhood I wasn't familiar with, but it definitely wasn't the kind of area where you'd expect to find a community center. The buildings were mostly commercial, with a lot of bars and late-night businesses. I drove around for a while, looking for anything that resembled a community center, but I couldn't find one. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. That wasn't unusual. She'd mentioned that they asked volunteers to keep their phones off during events. But standing there in that neighborhood, looking around at the types of establishments that surrounded me, I started to get a sinking feeling in my stomach. That's when I decided to do something I'm not proud of. I parked my car and waited. I knew approximately what time she usually got off, so I figured I'd wait and see where she actually came from. It felt like spying, and I hated myself for doing it, but I needed to know what was going on. Around 11:30, I saw her walking down the street, but she wasn't coming from any community center. She was coming from a building I'd driven past several times, a low, windowless structure with neon lighting around the entrance. Even from a distance, it was pretty obvious what kind of establishment it was. I sat in my car, watching as she walked to her own car and drove away. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some reasonable explanation for what I'd just seen. Maybe she'd been meeting someone there. Maybe she'd stopped in to use the bathroom. Maybe there was some perfectly innocent reason why she'd been inside what was clearly a strip club. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. The next morning, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept replaying the previous night in my head, trying to figure out what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, but another part of me felt like I needed more information before I said anything. I spent the day doing research on the building I'd seen her leave. It wasn't hard to find information about it online. It was called something generic, but all the reviews and photos made it clear that it was definitely a strip club. Not just any strip club, either. It was apparently one of the more upscale places in the city, the kind that advertised private rooms and exclusive experiences. That evening, she went through her usual routine, getting dressed up for her supposed volunteer work. I watched her leave, and then I made a decision that I'm still not sure was the right one. I got in my car and followed her. She drove straight to the same building I'd seen her leave the night before. But instead of going through the main entrance, she went around to a side door marked staff only. She had keys. She let herself in like she'd done it 100 times before. I sat there for about 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside. Finally, I parked my car and walked up to the main entrance. The bouncer at the door looked me up and down, clearly trying to figure out if I belonged there. I told him I was meeting a friend inside, and after a moment's hesitation, he let me pay the cover charge and go in. The inside was exactly what you'd expect from a strip club: dim lighting, loud music, stages with poles, and men sitting around watching performers. But I wasn't paying attention to any of that. I was looking for my roommate, trying to figure out what her role in all of this could possibly be. I found her about 10 minutes later, and what I saw completely threw me off. She wasn't performing, that much was obvious. Instead, she was walking around with a clipboard, talking to different people, clearly organizing something. She was wearing business casual clothes, not the kind of outfit the performers were wearing. She looked professional, competent, like she knew exactly what she was doing. I watched her for a while from across the room, trying to understand what I was seeing. She seemed to be coordinating the private room bookings, talking to customers about what they wanted, and then directing them to different areas of the club. She was also talking to the performers, apparently organizing their schedules and making sure everyone knew where they were supposed to be. The whole thing was surreal. This was not the person I thought I knew. The roommate I'd been living with for 2 years was shy about her body, modest in her dress, and had always seemed pretty conservative about things. But here she was, moving through this environment like she'd been born to it. Update 1. I couldn't bring myself to approach her that night. Instead, I slipped out before she could see me and drove home in a daze. I spent the entire next day trying to process what I'd witnessed, and by the time she got home from her regular job, I decided I needed to confront her about it. When she walked through the door, I was sitting on the couch waiting for her. She took one look at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. She asked me what was going on, and I just came out with it. I told her I'd seen her at the club, that I knew she wasn't really volunteering at a community center, and that I wanted an explanation. The look on her face went through about 5 different emotions in the span of 10 seconds. First surprise, then panic, then resignation, and finally something that looked almost like relief. She sat down across from me and was quiet for a long moment before she started talking. She told me the whole story. About 3 months earlier, her brother had gotten into some serious legal trouble. The details were complicated, but the bottom line was that he needed a lawyer, and good lawyers cost money that neither of them had. She'd been looking for ways to make extra income when a friend of a friend mentioned that this particular club was looking for someone to help with event coordination and private room management. The job wasn't what I'd expected. She wasn't involved in any of the performance aspects of the business. Instead, she was essentially running the administrative side of the VIP services. She'd meet with clients who wanted to book private rooms, coordinate with the performers to make sure the right people were available at the right times, and handle all the logistics that went into making sure the high-end customers had the experience they were paying for. She was good at it, apparently. Really good. The management had been so impressed with her organizational skills that they'd started giving her more responsibilities and more money. She was making almost as much in 2 nights a week at the club as she was making in her regular job. But she knew I wouldn't understand. She knew I'd judge her for it, assume the worst about what she was doing there. So she'd made up the story about volunteering at a community center, figured it would be easier than trying to explain the truth. As she was telling me all of this, I realized she was right. I was judging her. Even knowing that she wasn't doing anything I wouldn't do, even understanding that she was just trying to help her brother, there was still a part of me that was uncomfortable with the whole situation. The environment, the industry, the fact that she'd been lying to me for months, it all felt wrong somehow. We talked for hours that night. She told me more about what her job actually involved, about the people she worked with, about how the business operated. It wasn't what I'd expected. Yes, it was a strip club, but the way she described her role made it sound more like event planning and customer service. She wasn't doing anything that would have been inappropriate in any other context. But there were still things that bothered me, like how comfortable she seemed in that environment. When I'd watched her working that night, she hadn't looked like someone who was uncomfortable or out of place. She looked like someone who belonged there, who had found her niche. When I mentioned this, she got defensive. She said that being good at something didn't mean you necessarily enjoyed it or wanted to be doing it. She was good at organizing things, at managing people, at making sure events ran smoothly. Those skills translated well to what the club needed, but that didn't mean she was happy about having to use them in that context. Over the next few weeks, things between us were awkward. Not hostile exactly, but strained. I kept thinking about her other life, the one I discovered. Every Tuesday and Thursday when she got dressed up for work, I'd wonder what her night was going to be like, what kinds of situations she'd have to deal with. She tried to include me more in the conversation about it. She'd come home and tell me about her night, about the challenges she'd faced or the successes she'd had. It was clear she was trying to normalize the situation, to make it seem like just another job. And in some ways, that's exactly what it was. She had to deal with difficult customers, unreasonable demands, scheduling conflicts, and workplace drama, just like in any other job. The difference was the context, the environment where all of this was happening. But then something happened that changed everything. One Thursday night, she came home earlier than usual, and she was upset. Really upset. She'd been crying, and she looked shaken in a way I'd never seen before. When I asked her what was wrong, she told me about a situation that had happened at work. One of the regular customers had been drinking heavily and had become aggressive with one of the performers. The performer had come to my roommate for help, and she'd had to intervene, getting security involved and ultimately having the customer removed from the club. It had been handled properly, and no one was hurt, but the whole situation had rattled her. She kept talking about how scared the performer had been, how helpless she'd felt even though she'd done everything right. It was the first time she'd really been confronted with the darker side of the industry she was working in. That night, we had another long conversation. This time, it was different. Instead of her trying to convince me that everything was fine, she was questioning whether she wanted to keep doing this job. The money was good, and her brother still needed help with his legal bills, but she was starting to wonder if the psychological cost was worth it. Update 2. Things got more complicated over the next month. My roommate continued working at the club, but I could tell the incident with the aggressive customer had affected her more than she wanted to admit. She started coming home stressed more often, and she'd begun having trouble sleeping on the nights after her shifts. But then something unexpected happened. Her brother's legal situation took a turn for the better. Without going into all the details, it turned out that some new evidence had come to light that significantly helped his case. His lawyer was now confident that the charges would be reduced, and the fees weren't going to be nearly as high as they'd originally expected. This should have been great news. It meant she could quit the club job and go back to just working her regular job. But when she told me about it, she didn't seem as relieved as I'd expected her to be. Over the next few days, I started to understand why. She'd gotten good at the club job, really good. And despite the uncomfortable moments and the moral conflict she'd been having, there was a part of her that was proud of what she'd accomplished there. She'd taken a chaotic situation and brought order to it. She'd solved problems, managed crises, and earned the respect of both the management and the performers. More than that, she discovered skills she didn't know she had. She was good at reading people, at defusing tense situations, at making quick decisions under pressure. Her regular job had never challenged her in those ways. So when the financial pressure was lifted, instead of immediately quitting the club, she found herself considering whether she wanted to keep working there. Not because she had to, but because she'd found something she was genuinely good at. This created a whole new set of problems between us. When she'd been working there out of necessity, I could understand it even if I wasn't completely comfortable with it. But the idea that she might choose to stay there, that she might actually want to continue working in that environment, was harder for me to wrap my head around. We had several arguments about it. I kept asking her why she'd want to stay in an industry that had already shown her its dangerous side. She kept telling me that every industry had its problems, and at least here she felt like she was making a real difference in how things were run. She had a point. From what she'd told me, the club had been much more chaotic before she'd started working there. Customer complaints were down, The performers were happier with their working conditions, and the management was making more money because everything was running more efficiently. She wasn't just doing a job, she was actually improving the workplace for everyone involved. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with the whole situation. Maybe it was my own prejudices about the industry, or maybe it was just the fact that she'd started this whole thing by lying to me about it. Either way, I found myself wishing she'd just quit and move on. The tension between us came to a head about 6 weeks after her brother's legal situation had improved. She'd been hinting for a while that the club management had offered her a promotion, more money, more responsibilities, potentially even a path toward part ownership in the business. It was a real opportunity, the kind of career advancement that her regular job had never offered her. When she finally told me she was seriously considering taking the promotion, I lost it. I told her I thought she was making a huge mistake, that she was letting a temporary situation become a permanent life choice. I said things I regret now, about how I thought the environment was changing her, about how the person I'd watched working at the club that night seemed like a stranger. She fired back that I was being judgmental and narrow-minded, that I was more concerned with what other people would think than with what actually made her happy. She accused me of trying to control her choices because I was uncomfortable with them, even though they didn't actually affect me. The fight escalated until she finally said something that stopped me cold. She told me that for the first time in her adult life, she felt like she was good at something that mattered. Not just competent, but actually skilled and valued. She said her regular job made her feel invisible and replaceable, but at the club, people respected her opinion and relied on her expertise. After she said that, I realized I'd been looking at the whole situation wrong. I'd been so focused on the industry and the environment that I'd missed what was really happening. She'd found work that challenged her, that used her skills, that made her feel valuable. The fact that it was happening in a strip club was secondary to the fact that she'd discovered something about herself that she hadn't known before. That night, after we'd both calmed down, we had one more long conversation. This time, instead of arguing about whether she should stay or go, we talked about what she actually wanted out of her career and her life. It became clear that the regular job she'd been working for years had been slowly crushing her spirit, making her feel like she wasn't capable of anything important. The club job, whatever else it was, had given her confidence. She'd learned that she could handle difficult situations, that she could earn respect through competence, that she could make a real difference in how an organization operated. Those were valuable discoveries, regardless of where she'd made them. But she also admitted that she wasn't sure she wanted to make the industry her permanent career. The promotion offer had forced her to think seriously about what her long-term goals were, and she wasn't sure this was the path she wanted to follow for the next decade of her life. Final update. After weeks of back and forth, my roommate made a decision that surprised both of us. She took the promotion at the club, but only temporarily. She negotiated a 6-month contract that would give her the experience and the title, but wouldn't lock her into staying long-term. Her plan was to use those 6 months to build up her resume and her confidence, and then start looking for opportunities that would let her use her newly discovered skills in a different context. Event management, hospitality, customer relations. There were lots of industries where her abilities would be valuable. It was actually a pretty smart strategy. Instead of just walking away from the job, she was going to leverage it into something better. She'd get the professional development and the reference letters, and then she'd move on to something that aligned better with her long-term goals. The 6 months turned out to be exactly what she needed. She learned more about business operations, about managing people, about handling high-pressure situations. But she also confirmed that this wasn't where she wanted to spend her career. The work was satisfying in some ways, but the environment was too stressful and the hours were too irregular for what she wanted her life to look like. Near the end of her contract, she started job hunting seriously. And because she now had experience managing complex operations and dealing with difficult customers, she was able to apply for positions that would have been out of reach before. She interviewed for several jobs that were significant steps up from her previous position. She ended up getting hired by a company that manages corporate events and conferences. It's not the most exciting industry in the world, but it uses all the skills she developed at the club: organization, crisis management, customer service, people management, in an environment that she's much more comfortable with long-term. The transition wasn't completely smooth. There were a few weeks where she wasn't sure she'd made the right choice, where she missed the intensity and the immediate feedback of the club environment. Her new job was more bureaucratic, less dynamic, and it took some time for her to find her place in the corporate structure. But 6 months into the new job, she settled in well. She's already been given additional responsibilities, and her manager has hinted that there are opportunities for advancement if she continues performing at her current level. She's making good money, working reasonable hours, and doing work that she finds meaningful. Looking back on the whole experience, I think we both learned things about ourselves that we wouldn't have discovered otherwise. She learned that she was capable of much more than she'd given herself credit for, that she could handle challenges and responsibilities that would have intimidated her before. I learned that my assumptions about people and industries weren't always accurate, and that sometimes the right choice isn't the obvious one. The experience also changed our relationship, mostly for the better. We're more honest with each other now, more willing to have difficult conversations instead of letting problems fester. She's less worried about disappointing me, and I'm less quick to judge choices that I don't immediately understand. She still keeps in touch with some of the people she worked with at the club. A few of the performers have moved on to other things, and she's been able to help them with job searches and references. The management still occasionally asks her for advice on operational issues, which she takes as a compliment to the work she did there. The whole situation taught me that people's lives are more complicated than they appear on the surface, and that sometimes the choices that seem wrong from the outside make perfect sense when you understand the full context. My roommate wasn't just working at a strip club. She was building skills, gaining confidence, and figuring out what she was capable of achieving. Her brother's legal issues were eventually resolved successfully, and he's gotten his life back on track. The money she made at the club definitely helped with that, but more importantly, the experience helped her understand her own potential in a way that changed the trajectory of her entire career. These days, when people ask her how she developed such strong management skills, she usually gives a diplomatic answer about previous experience in hospitality and customer service. It's not technically a lie, but it's not the whole truth either. She's learned that some stories are too complicated to explain in casual conversation. But between us, she's proud of what she accomplished during those months. She took a difficult situation and turned it into an opportunity for growth. She learned things about herself that she never would have discovered in any other context. And ultimately, she used that experience as a stepping stone to something better. The whole thing has made me think differently about judgment and assumptions. When I first discovered what she was really doing, my reaction was based on my preconceptions about the industry and the people who work in it. But once I got past those preconceptions and looked at what she was actually doing, solving problems, managing people, creating order from chaos, I realized that the skills were more important than the setting. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. My roommate learned that she was capable of handling much more responsibility and pressure than she'd ever imagined. I learned that supporting someone sometimes means setting aside your own comfort zone and trusting their judgment about their own life. We're still roommates, and we're still friends. But we're both different people than we were when this whole thing started. She's more confident, more ambitious, more willing to take calculated risks. I'm more open-minded, more willing to ask questions before making judgments, more aware that everyone's story is more complicated than it appears. The experience wasn't easy for either of us, but looking back, I wouldn't change how it played out. Sometimes the most difficult conversations and the most uncomfortable situations are the ones that lead to the most growth. And sometimes the choices that seem wrong on the surface turn out to be exactly what someone needs to discover who they really are.